This is not, as it may appear, a story of inaction in a time of crisis, but instead it was the final action of Donald Trump's own plan to assert the will of the American people and remain in power.
The forces Donald Trump ignited that day have not gone away. The militant, intolerant ideologies, the militias, the alienation and the disaffection, the weird fantasies and disinformation. They're all still out there, ready to go.
Last night, the January 6th committee delivered its closing arguments to the country, and nearly 18 million people tuned in. The arguments were also directed at one person in particular, Attorney General Merrick Garland, who must now decide what actions his Department of Justice will or won't take against the people who sought to overturn American democracy. We know the DOJ has been paying attention to these hearings. How could they not? They have repeatedly requested materials from the January 6th committee. They've been frustrated. The committee has not moved quickly enough. The New York Times has also reported that some of the evidence and testimony in these hearings has, quote, jolted top Justice Department officials into discussing the topic of Donald Trump more directly. Last night's hearing was the last presentation we will get from the committee until September. They have laid out what evidence they have for the time being. Now, the question is, what does the Department of Justice do? I'm joined now by Ian Bassin, former associate White House counsel, who just co-authored a piece arguing that Merrick Garland's job in weighing a Trump indictment is not to heal the nation. And Danya Perry, former deputy chief of the criminal division for the Southern District of New York, co-author of the Brookings report, Trump on Trial, a guide to the January 6 hearings and the question of criminality. Ian, let me start with you because I thought your piece in the New York Review of Books was really good. It argues a point about how Garland and others at DOJ should be approaching the question. And I think there's sort of roughly two ways, right? One is approach this like a normal criminal case. If you have the factual predicate, you open an investigation. If you think a crime is committed that you can get a conviction, you do it. The other is, this is a unicorn. This is a first in American history. You got to think of all the democratic and institutional equities at play. And you kind of come down on the first, on the former. Why?
Because what the piece explains is that the Attorney General's job is both narrower and, frankly, simpler than a lot of people have argued. It's to determine if there's sufficient evidence to convict Trump of federal crimes, and if the traditional principles of federal prosecutorial discretion point in favor of indictment, which in this case they do, then he has to indict. And the reason for that, and Erica Newland, who co-authored this piece with me, who was a law clerk to then Judge Merrick Garland, the reason for that is because Garland's jurisdiction is limited by the founders' design. The founders understood that there may be moments in the life of a nation when extending an olive branch to, as Alexander Hamilton put it, rebels or insurrectionists would be necessary to heal the nation, to mend the nation. But the founders said the only person, the only office that should have the power to do that is the presidency through the pardon power, because it required a position that could weigh all of the complicated factors that would go into making such a decision. And if Merrick Garland were to decide to abstain because of these sort of special unicorn case considerations, he would essentially be usurping from the president a power that the founders vested solely in the president, and that courts have said the president cannot delegate to anybody else.
I thought that I had not thought of it that way. I found it an incredibly persuasive argument. It's not his job to figure out like what mercy will save the nation from, and the Whiskey Rebellion, I think a bunch of the folks, one of the first insurrections taken up against the U.S. government, that Washington gets back on his horse and rides into town to put down. A bunch of them got pardons, if I'm not mistaken, for their role as a sort of, we need to heal the nation kind of decision, but it's a decision made after the normal processes. And on the question of the normal processes, Danya, I think there's a sort of interesting dynamic where, like, the committee is clearly frustrated. I mean, they clearly think DOJ is not doing enough. I mean, here's Luria today on Morning Joe on MSNBC giving her comments, her thoughts on the Department of Justice. Take a listen.
I sure as hell hope that Merrick Garland has an open criminal investigation into Donald Trump. I mean, with what we've laid out there, no one needs to wait for some formality from our committee to have that ball in motion.
Danya, clearly Merrick Garland is also in his own way, I think, kind of frustrated. Like, you guys get to put on your show. You don't have an adversarial system. You don't have the rules of federal criminal procedure, evidentiary thresholds, and we have to do the real thing here, which is not screw this up. What do you think is happening in Department of Justice? Do you think on the facts alone there is enough right now for what Luria said, the factual predicate to open a criminal investigation?
There's overwhelming factual predication to open an investigation. I also found Ian's piece very interesting, and I learned a lot about sort of the long view, the long historical view for the AG's role here. But it's also been codified in a way, it's been memorialized what his role is and what DOJ's role is in the Department of Justice manual. And that says very simply that a prosecutor should pursue charges if there is, in the prosecution's view, probably sufficient evidence to obtain and sustain a conviction. There is more than that in this case. And that manual also explicitly prevents the prosecutors from looking at such considerations as the popularity or unpopularity, political or otherwise, of a potential target of an investigation. So I think there are many reasons why Merrick Garland, of course, is looking at this, as he himself has said, very seriously, but really should follow the rules that apply in every single prosecution in this country and do what the facts very clearly counsel here, which is do this investigation, do it thoroughly, but get it done, because time is in fact running short.
Well, that's the question, timing, too, Ian. I mean, one of the things Garland says is, look, we don't do these in public, and that's true. And I think, honestly, the nation learned how dangerous it is when they do things in public during 2016 when James Comey, put on the James Comey show about an FBI investigation into one of the candidates, to enormous consequence. What do you think about timeline and the sort of public-facing nature, if any, that there should be from DOJ? And Danielle, I'll ask you the same question after Ian.
Well, I think Ben Wittes has a good piece in Lawfare this week explaining that actually the timeline here looks relatively standard for a case of this complexity and reminds us that in 1974, when the first big three of Nixon's aides were put on trial, it was almost 2 years after the break-in. And ultimately, the decision about what to do with Nixon in terms of his legal fate came 2 years later as well. And as we were preparing the piece for the New York Review of Books, we looked deeply into the Watergate special prosecutor's considerations then. And not only did the founders take the view that the Attorney General's job was limited and it wasn't his job to decide about grace, but that was the view of the Watergate special prosecutor as well. In this situation, if facts are sufficient to indict, then the Attorney General has only one option, and that's to indict.
What do you think, Danya?
I think that, the timeline, I take Ian's point. I think that probably is exactly right in the normal course. But as embedded in your earlier question, this case is a unicorn in some ways, and the DOJ cannot proceed in the way as it normally does, which is a bottom-up approach, pick off the low-hanging fruit, cooperate up, take its time. There is a timeline here. There is some urgency here because of the upcoming elections and because of DOJ guidelines, which also do not allow for prosecutions and overt investigations when there is a pending a campaign or an election.
All right, Ian Bassin and Danya Perry, that was really illuminating. Thank you both. Enjoy your weekend.